morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are joining us from in the world today. My name is Ron Hoppe. I am the CEO of Worldwide HealthStaff Solutions, and I'd like to begin this morning by thanking each and every one of you for joining this very important webinar presentation today titled Your Retrogression Survival Guide. I'm particularly excited to be joined by two of the leading healthcare immigration attorneys in the U.S. that we've had the privilege of working with here at Worldwide HealthStaff for many years. Both of them are deeply knowledgeable of all matters related to healthcare immigration, and just want to thank both Mike Hammond and Chris Musillo in advance for taking time out of their schedule to join us today. Just very briefly, because we do want to jump right in, there's a lot of ground to cover. Today's webinar is our first session of this type, where we have both U.S. employers as well as applicants from around the world joining us. So we look forward to interacting with each of you. As you can see on the chat box on your screen, this is how we're going to field questions throughout the webinar. One of my colleagues is going to be monitoring the chat, and we look forward to answering as many questions as possible as we get to the end of our sort of guided discussion on this topic today. Also, if you are an applicant, you'll see in the chat box on the upper right-hand corner on my screen anyway, several links there, one of which is going to connect you live with the HealthStaff recruiter. If you're wanting to speak directly with the HealthStaff recruiter during or immediately after this, you just need to click on that link and you'll be connected. So with those few housekeeping matters out of the way, we're going to jump right in. And I'm going to start off. Mike Hammond, thank you for joining us. And Mike, retrogression is a big word that most folks don't use in their everyday vocabulary. Can you take just a moment and just give us a definition of what retrogression really means?
Sure. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, retrogression is basically the idea that there is greater demand for visas than there is the supply. And when you have greater demand than supply, a line forms. And so the whole idea of retrogression is we go from where you're at the front of the line, or what the terminology that's used by the Department of State, current, to where there is a wait. And the wait and the retrogression in our circumstances here is divided up by country and by category. And there are certain countries that have their own line. Philippines, Mexico, India has their own, China has their own line. Everybody else falls into what's called rest of the world. And then we have different classifications. And for our discussion today, probably 75-80% of the people on this call are RNs or hiring RNs. We're focused on what's called the EB3 category. If you're a OT, a PT, you might be in the EB2 category, but for our discussions today, it's mainly EB3. So a line forms, which is simply a wait. I like to describe it to some people as the queue in the market, where you go to the market and you pull off a little ticket and they call out, number 62, and you look at your ticket and it says 96, and you've got that much longer to wait in the line. But it is purely a supply and demand issue.
All right, Mike, thanks for that. Every month, the U.S. State Department issues a publication that's commonly known or referred to as the Visa Bulletin. We recently received from the State Department the August Visa Bulletin. And Chris, if you could maybe just take a moment and just share what the August Visa Bulletin is communicating to us at this time.
Yeah, so the August Visa Bulletin came out about 2 or so weeks ago. And again, I'll limit most of this to the EB3, as Mike said, since that's probably the vast majority of the folks here on this call today. And so for rest of world, which covers all countries except for India and China, for the purposes of this conversation, we're seeing a rest of world date for the employment-based visas as May of 2020. And so what that essentially means is that your case cannot be scheduled for an interview at a U.S. embassy unless your priority date is before May of 2020. And so that's the August date. It had been in February of 2022 for the May and June and July visa bulletins, which was obviously not as bad as 2020. And Ron, I think one of the important things is that while it did retrogress about 2 years beyond even the first retrogression, I don't think it's nearly as people should be nearly as nervous as they might otherwise be. And the reason for that is the U.S. fiscal year runs October 1st until September 30th. And so it is actually very common in most years for dates to retrogress in the August visa bulletin and September visa bulletin, because we are getting near the end of the U.S. fiscal year. And so there's only a few visas left in this year's allocation. And so by setting the dates back, really what the U.S. government is doing is they're ensuring that for those very few visas that are available, they're going to the cases that are longest delayed, i.e. the ones with the oldest priority dates.
Yeah, very good. I'm glad you mentioned that, Chris, that we are at a very sort of unique time of the year, and that in October of each year, there's a new allotment, an annual allotment of 140,000 visas that becomes available. We've faced this type of circumstance and situation before. I think between Chris, Mike, and myself, we probably have the years of industry experience that's closer to a century than to half a century. Hate to admit that in some ways, actually. So we've certainly encountered this type of situation before. Mike, can you maybe just very briefly speak to the last time we had any significant retrogression for any period of time? And then, Chris, if you can maybe just comment on how you think circumstances may be different now.
Sure. And by the way, I just have to interject right now that if you look at the chat group, there's a whole lot of people going, wow, that's a really, really awesome shirt Mike has on. Where did that come from? And so I just wanted to say this is compliments of Ron and the worldwide team. And hopefully Chris will have one next call. And so then we can all have them. So I appreciate all the comments in the chat group. Thanks, guys. So the last big retrogression, we're talking huge, 2008, 2009 time frame was the last really large one. We've had some in between a little bit, but the last really big one was 2008, 2009. And for people who follow economics and recall the history of that, it was a time when there was also some major economic turmoil going on in that time frame. I think to jump back on something Chris said about the August and the October bulletin, when you're looking at your case individually, all retrogression is bad retrogression, right? Your date went backwards. You're impacted personally. When we look at this as an ecosystem, summer retrogression is actually a good thing, because we work off of a system called a use it or lose it. So as Ron just mentioned, there's 140,000 new visas allotted each year. And let's pretend that number stays static throughout the whole year, so we only have 140,000. If at the end of September, we've only used 135,000, then those 5,000 extra visas that could have been allocated are simply dumped. They're wasted. They're lost. So when we have summer retrogression and the dates continue to fall back, it tells us that the system is working efficiently. And I rarely use that word when I'm talking about the government system, but it's using efficiently. It's using all those visas up. So from a big picture perspective, we'd all like all 140,000 to be used by the end of the year so that everyone that has a chance gets to go in. So I think we want to look at summer retrogression a little differently than everything else. So I think Chris is going to talk about how this retrogression is very different than the last one.
Yeah, or how it could be different. Thanks.
Could
Mike.
be different.
Chris, thoughts on how this retrogression, as Mike said, in 08, 09, the retrogression was multiple years, right? Many years. Just with kind of where we're at and what we expect to see happen. How might this particular instance be different than these circumstances in the past?
Yeah, so it might be different. On some level, all retrogressions are the same, right? As Mike said, all retrogression is it's a backlog of visas. But the way this one might be different is we do anticipate come October here, there'll be a new allocation of visas. That new allocation of visas will move the date forward from 2020. We don't really know exactly where it will go. Some of that will come down to how many visas are used in the July, August, September timeframe at the end of this year. In terms of how it will be different, I think it's hard to say how it will be different because predicting the future of retrogression is just difficult. I think predicting where dates will be in 6 months or a year is almost impossible to guess. My sense internally is that we will continue to see a retrogression for the foreseeable future, although I do not think it will get anywhere near the 5 or so years that we saw back in 2008 and 9, as Mike was saying.
Yeah. Chris, I know you're very involved, as is Mike, but I understand you're actually in Washington today, very involved in various advocacy and efforts and lobbying efforts. And I know there's a number of proposals that are being brought forward to elected officials in Washington. I think one thing that is different now is, as a result of the pandemic, issues around healthcare workforce, the fragility of the healthcare workforce is probably top of mind for people in a way that it never has been in the past. Can you maybe speak just for a moment to some of the regulatory / legislative proposals that are being discussed in Washington these days?
Yeah, that's right. I'm actually in Washington right now. In fact, I've got breakfast in about an hour or two with the State Department. It's with a member of the State Department who helps coordinate a lot of the visa flows. And frankly, as Mike said, one of the things we're going to tell him is he's doing a great job from our vantage point, because he is, and the State Department, the consulates, they're handcuffed by what the laws say. And so their main goal is to make sure that all the visas are used before the end of the year in September, because it's a use it or lose it. And so, as Mike said, if we were going to look at one of the bright spots of a retrogression in the summer, a bright spot would be the State Department's doing an excellent job for the U.S., meaning that they are using the full allocation of visas. So that's good news. In terms of legislation, I was in a bunch of meetings yesterday. I'll be at more today and tomorrow. Many of you who've been paying attention in this area for some time may be familiar with the HWRA, which was a bill that was first proposed maybe 3 or so years ago. And broadly speaking, what it does is it creates an allocation of visas just for nurses. And that bill, in just 2 years, was able to get 25% of the U.S. Senate on board, and about 60 or 70 House members out of an aggregate total of about 430 or so. So it got also, again, about 20 or so percent of the House. It got about 25% of the Senate. And so for a new piece of legislation, that's very positive. The new legislation, HWRA 2023, has not yet been introduced into Congress, but don't think that means that it's not going to be introduced in Congress. There's some strategic talk happening behind the scenes as to actually what the final version of HWRA 2023 is going to say. and when it's going to be released. But I am optimistic that something will be released certainly before the end of the year, probably a lot sooner than the end of the year. The U.S. Congress is on a recess starting next week, I think, and then they recess all the way into September. So you won't really see much of anything in August. They do have what's called a pro forma session, which is essentially just very few senators and congressmen will be here in D.C. I doubt we'd see anything announced during that pro forma session in August, but come regular session in September, that would be the next time frame where a piece of legislation might be introduced. And some of that is actually going to be contingent upon some of the meetings that we're having this week.
All right. Very good. And by HWRA, you're referring to the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act. And
that's right.
It's something that we've been speaking with HealthStaff clients about as well. And I think we'll circle back and just discuss that a little bit further before we wrap up today. As I said, we have both applicants and employers on today. And I think this issue probably resonates a little differently with each group. So I want to take a few minutes and speak specifically in the context of applicants and employers. And Mike, I'll ask you to kick us off here in speaking to applicants around the world. Their question, very simply stated, that I'm hearing most often is, what should I do now? And that question is coming both from applicants that have existing applications underway, as well as applicants that are just at a point of considering getting started on their journey to the U.S. So let's start responding to our applicant's question, what should I do now?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things to kind of recognize is what retrogression means from a big picture perspective, okay? It doesn't change the process at all. It doesn't change any criteria for how you have to qualify to ultimately get a green card. What it does change is it changes the timing of how long that takes. And I think that's important to note, because what that means is that everything you needed to do before retrogression, pass your NCLEX, pass your English exams, etc., all are the exact same thing now. Nothing has changed relative to your activities. So if you were studying to take the NCLEX, continue studying. You're studying to do the English exam, continue studying. Continue proceeding on that. Now, there are a couple things that I think you've got to keep in mind, and they deal with where you're working at now. So, for example, let's say that you are working on an overseas assignment and you only have 3 months left in your contract. And instead of you being able to come to the U.S. in, say, 8 to 10 months, maybe that time frame is going to be more like a year and a half kind of time frame. You need to consider whether or not you want to renew your current contract, because now you're going to have a longer period of time. Renewing it with only 3 months to go, if you only had 8 months left, makes no sense. But maybe renewing it now, at least for another year, makes some sense. So you're going to want to work with your case manager, with your hiring employer, with the lawyer on your case to make sure that that fits your circumstances relative to your work assignments. I think it's also important for you to take into consideration your visa appointment. We normally when we file the very first step of the green card case, the I-140, and that's what establishes your priority date. There's something on there that says, where do you want to have your interview at? It's worded differently than that, but that's what it means. Where do you want to have your interview at? And if we were filing your case with no retrogression, we may have chosen the place where you were on a long-term contract at. You're in the UK, you're going to be there for the next 12 months. Maybe we pick the UK, you're going to go to London. If you're in a situation where you know now with retrogression that you're not going to renew your contract in the UK, and that a year and a half from now you're going to be back in Manila, wherever you're going to be, then we want to know that so we can file that case indicating that you want to have your interview in Manila. And so I think that's another factor. You want to work with your case manager, the law firm, to make sure that that is. And then the last thing I'll mention with respect to applicants. For any of you that have children that are in the 16, 17, 18-year-old range, kids generally speaking age out at 21. It's more complicated than that. For purposes of this call, let's just pretend it at 21. You need to make sure someone is aware of your child aging out at a particular period of time. If your kid's 12, don't worry about it. But if they're anywhere in those upper teen years, because you're also planning, where's my kid going to go to college at? Where are they going to start school at? How do I coordinate all those kind of life things? So I think there are some important things that you want to be aware of as a result of retrogression, but it should not change at all the core activities that you engage in. You control what you can control and let the rest of the process kind of move forward.
Right. Very good. Mike, just kind of keeping on this theme and maybe looking at the other side of that same coin. So that was very clear in terms of what they should do. From an applicant's perspective, speak to some of the things that they should not do in response to this development.
Well, I think without a couple things. One, just from a really big picture perspective, and this is more of just an emotional kinds of thing, is you shouldn't kind of look at it and go, oh my goodness, it's now going to take so long. I'm not going to do it. And then you've got a situation where you're having the same conversation in your own mind 3 months from now, and now you're 3 months further behind. So if you really want to come to the U.S., you really want to work in the U.S., and that's your plan, that's your goal, you want to kind of move forward.
Yeah.
Some specific things, and I kind of mentioned them a little bit, but don't, postpone taking your exam. If you're scheduled for your exam and you're ready for your exam, take your exam. Visa screens are good for 5 years. There's no reason to delay the visa screen. If you're working, don't stop working. If you are with an employer and that employer's already filed an I-140 for you and you're committed to that employer, there's not any employers who are immune from retrogression. We're all in the exact same situation. So if you get an agency and your employer who tells you, I can get you through the line faster because we're not subject to retrogression, run from that agency or that employer because it's not real. So be very careful with those types of things.
Yeah, very good. And I would just add to that a big one that we come across is don't stop gaining clinical experience. We're certainly very understanding and respectful of the different reasons why RNs sometimes seek non-bedside employment opportunities in various countries. And we are very understanding of that for certain. But the importance of gaining and maintaining current bedside and hands-on caregiving experience always critical throughout the journey to the U.S. Chris, I'd like to come back to you and kind of address similar questions from an employer's perspective. So we've got this new backlog in processing times. I think, expect them to move closer to current come here later this year. So just very simply, speaking to employers, what should they be doing now?
Yeah, so this is very important, and I think a few things. The first thing, whenever we onboard a new employer at our law firm, is we always tell them that bringing in foreign nurses is not going to solve your nursing workforce challenges in 2023. The reality is even in the best of times, this is not us. When we were doing our prep, the three of us in advance of this call, one of the things we said is, really a retrogression of about a year is almost like there's no retrogression, Ron. And the reason is because it takes time to get your prevailing wage determination, notify your union or notify your employees, depending on if you're a union or non-union shop, get your I-140s prepared and filed and approved, then go through the National Visa Center stage, which is where the nurses submit additional documentation to the State Department, ultimately, and then the nurses take their interviews. And that process, even in the best of times, the fastest we will ever see something like that is something like 8, 9, 10 months. Usually one of those processes has a little bump in the road. Maybe the nurse takes a little long getting something done. Maybe the notices don't get posted quite as quickly as we'd like. Sometimes, very often, the U.S. government takes a little longer than they should on some of these things. So, number one, I think if you're an employer, remember that a retrogression of about a year is almost like no retrogression. Number two, your workforce issues that you have in 2023 are almost certainly going to be worse in 2024 and 2026 and 2028. Why is that? Well, if you look at this, the McKinsey study is probably the most prominent study, but it mirrors several other studies over the last couple of years. We are currently sitting at a U.S. nursing shortage of between 200,000 and 250,000, which means if tomorrow we snapped our fingers and 200,000 nurses entered the workforce, we would still have openings. And that's not going to happen. Even in the best of times, foreign nursing is maybe 15% of the U.S. workforce. So that's, I don't know, 30,000, we're not going to even get 30,000 foreign nurses. So number two, recognize that your workforce challenges that are here today are going to continue to be here in the second half of this decade and maybe even into the 2030s. The next thing is the nurses I have found are always committed to this process. From the nurse's perspective, she or he is not thinking that this is a 9-month process or a 1-year process. Many of these folks have been interested in becoming nurses and eventually coming to the United States since they were teenagers. So they are deeply committed to this in a long-term viewpoint. And so what we suggest employers do is they take the medium and long-term view and continue to process this. One thing that I think Mike and I can say for sure in doing this for 25 years, and Ron can say for doing recruiting for longer than that even, is the visa will get there. Pre-retrogression, it might have taken 9 months or 12 months. When the retrogression gets through in October, it might be a year or two, but it's not going to be 5 years. It's not going to be 10 years. These nurses will get here. They're still committed. They're still going to be focusing on keeping their clinical skills up to speed. So, one of the things that and sort of this is a broad point for both employers and employees, let's focus on what we can control. And from an employer standpoint, what you can control is continuing to work the process, recognizing that your workforce challenges are going to continue to be there. All the demographics suggest they're going to be there. And from the nurse's perspective, control what you can control. Get your NCLEX passed, get your visa screen done, like Mike was saying, and take care of the things you can control. And in terms of timing, we all want it to go faster. But some of that's beyond our control, and so let's focus on what we can control.
All right. Now that's great, Chris. And just to put a little finer point, I think you spoke to this very clearly, but just to put a little finer point on this, same question or same point we had for applicants from an employer's perspective. What should they not be doing at this time in response to this recent development?
Me or Mike? I'm wrong.
Yeah, Chris, please.
Yeah. So I think the main thing you shouldn't do is you shouldn't overcommit on a contract. You should talk to your recruiter, talk to your lawyer. What's a realistic chance? You probably shouldn't make any sudden moves now until mid-September when the October visa bulletin comes out. The October visa bulletin is so critical because it's the first visa bulletin of the year, and it really will give experienced practitioners like the three of us a real insight as to not only where the visa bulletin is going to be in October, but we can take very much better educated guesses as to where the visa bulletin is going to be in the rest of 2023 and into 2024 once we see the October visa bulletin. And so if you're an applicant, you want to keep those clinical skills up, you want to keep that visa screen valid. I'm constantly surprised how quickly the State Department can turn on and off these visa appointments. And what you would hate is you get a visa appointment and you don't have your visa screen because for some reason you didn't either apply for it or extend it. As Mike said, they're valid for 5 years. So make sure you're keeping your visa screen up. If you're early in the process, you should absolutely be studying and preparing to take the NCLEX examination. If you're an employer, you should make sure your prevailing wage determinations are valid. That process, unfortunately, takes 6, 7, 8 months from the from the Department of Labor, and we need those prevailing wage determinations. So let's get those. Let's make sure our notices are up and running so that we can continue to file I-140s. And so what you should not be doing is thinking that this retrogression means that whether you're an employer or an employee, you can stop for a while doing what you're doing, because all that's going to mean is that you're further behind in the queue. So those, I think, are the key takeaways from both the employer and employee perspective.
Right. So I think in summary, Mike and Chris, what you've both said, if I can kind of put a bit of a lighter take on this, is it's be calm and carry on. I think would be a summary. I want to take just a second, and I think this is going to be of some interest to both applicants and U.S. employers alike, and just to add a little bit of perspective to some of the things that are happening in the dynamic of nurse graduates, both here in the U.S. as well as internationally. And this is just some data that's pretty much hot off the press. This information comes from the National Council of State Boards of Nursing that just recently reported on worldwide 2022 NCLEX exam takers and passers. And just a couple of things that jumped out at me that I thought would be worth sharing, just to kind of help give everybody the biggest possible perspective on this issue. And the data is telling us clearly that international nurses are increasingly representing a larger portion of the U.S. workforce. So when we take a look at the number of domestically educated nurses taking the NCLEX exam, and the number of international nurses taking the NCLEX exam, the number of international nurses is increasing far more quickly on a percentage basis than the number of nurses taking the exam here in the U.S. Internationally, we've known for some time that amongst first-time international test takers, the pass rate is in round numbers 50%. And that's why at Worldwide HealthStaff, we're so focused on recruiting only NCLEX passers. But what is of real interest is that the licensure exam pass rate in the United States has dropped precipitously. In 2020, 78% of U.S. nursing graduates taking the exam passed. That number was only 69% in 2020. We could spend a lot of time trying to analyze why that is, but for purposes of today's conversation, I just want to acknowledge that this development is critically important because it essentially negates any increase in enrollment that might have been seen in U.S. nursing colleges in recent years. And this is one to be watched very, very carefully here in the next couple of years. Despite all the attention drawn to nursing workforce and the need to educate more nurses, the number of new U.S. grads is essentially flat. We were just right around 173,000 in 2020. We were right around 179,000 in 2022. And when you factor in this declining pass rate, this much lower pass rate, the number of new grads eligible to enter the workforce is flat at a time where retirements are increasing, demand is increasing, the population is increasing. So the challenge is real. I think Chris commented on the issues we all face today, we're going to face in 2026 and 2028. I think we can safely project out that if we reconvene as a group sometime in early 2030s, we'll be having a very similar conversation to what we're having today in terms of supply-demand disparity. And while the percentage of domestically educated nurses passing is down, the number of nurses eligible to enter the workforce in the U.S. is essentially flat. The number of international nurses that have taken and passed the NCLEX exam from 2020 to 2022 is up by 291%. So in terms of, I'll just add to Chris's comment of what employers should be doing now. The pool of candidates is more robust now than we have seen it in a while. So this is an opportunity to continue to feed your pipeline or to establish a new pipeline. Again, some data not exactly related to the topic, but I just thought it would add to the perspective of the discussion and some of the points that were made today. So just as we wrap up sort of our guided commentary here this morning, and before we enter into taking some questions, Mike, I'll ask you to go first, and then Chris, I'll ask you to follow up and just share with us, your predictions in terms of what you think is going to happen from now till September 30th and from October onwards, 1st onwards. I know we've touched on this kind of as we've gone through the conversation, but I just thought it would be a good place to wrap up. Mike, if you want to go first, and then Chris, if you want to share your predictions as well.
Sure. So I'll cover between today and September 30th, because that's all just sad, negative, depressing, bad news. I mean, Chris can do the happy October 1st onward stuff, and then that'll fit perfectly for us. Between now and September 30th, no one should expect any forward movement whatsoever. If you're thinking that all of a sudden maybe they'll move forward a little bit in September, I'm sorry, but I think you're going to be sadly disappointed. If anything, we're going to see it retrogress further, or we may even get something called a U, which is a U in the column, which simply stands unavailable. That simply means we have eaten every piece of this pie and there's no pie left. It's unavailable until October 1st. So I would frankly, if I'm in the queue, I wouldn't really look at the September bulletin. Now, we're all going to look anyway, right? Because we just have to. It's just our nature. We have no choice. We're going to look. But I would not take whatever the bulletin says for September and apply it to my circumstances whatsoever. It'll be very irrelevant.
All right. Very good. Let's get over to Chris as quickly as we can.
Exactly. There we go.
Right. So we're going to bring out the pies come October after Mike's pieless fall here. And what we're going to do is we're going to have 140,000 employment-based visas dumped into the system. The visa retrogression is no longer going to be retrogressed back in 2020. It is going to progress. Where is it going to be progress? My sense is somewhere between the early 2020 retrogression that we saw in the April, May, June timeframe, probably a little further than that, maybe third or fourth quarter of 2022, which would be about a year retrogression. And sort of, I think, if we were going to try and put the nicest bow we can on this, Ron, if it's third and fourth quarter of 2022 and we are in the fourth quarter of 2023, that's about a 1 year retrogression, which is, as we've kind of been saying today on this call, it's almost like no retrogression.
Right. Well, very good. Mike and Chris, thanks for those very insightful comments. Greatly appreciated. Our colleague, Tracy Drake, is behind the scenes monitoring questions that might have come in through the chat. Tracy, I don't know if you've got any questions to share. I certainly encourage everyone that has joined us to share your questions. And just a quick reminder for everyone that has joined us today, be on the lookout. About 24 hours from now, you're going to receive an email that'll have a link to a recording of this presentation. So if there's anything that you'd like to review, you're able to do so. And also, if you have friends and colleagues who may not have been able to join us today or register for this event, feel free to share that link with them as well so that they can benefit from the information that Chris and Mike have been able to share with us this morning. So, Tracy, any questions to get us kicked off here?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Chris. Let's jump right into the questions. And I'm just going to pose this to the panel, and maybe the first to answer takes it. All right, here's our first question. I completed my embassy interview April 25th, 2023. What are my chances? Please let me know if there is any chance of getting to the USA that speeds up this process.
No is probably the answer. The reality is the EB3 is retrogressed to 2020. I'm not sure I heard what that priority date was, but I'm going to assume it's after the 2020 retrogression date we have. And so not only will it not happen? It legally can't happen. The U.S. government is not allowed to even allow you to go through the interview and issue a visa until October 1st. And then depending on what your priority date is, you might move fast in October or November. So the answer is nothing's going to happen in July, August, and September. Depending on your priority date, it might happen in October.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add, if you went to your interview in April and were issued a 221G, which might be why were not issued a visa at the time of the interview, go ahead and don't focus on retrogression, focus on getting that 221G resolved. Whether it's something that you needed, birth records, marriage records, whatever it was, make sure you resolve your 221G as quickly as possible so that when October 1st comes around, if your priority date's current, then you can be in that queue to receive your visa right away.
All right, excellent. Tracy, next question, please.
Sure. My daughter will be aging out this October, and she is included in my petition. My priority date is 2021 and case ready. Will I still be able to bring her?
So the number one thing you want to do is you want to get in contact with your recruiter and your attorney. And the reason you want to do that is I'm going to assume she's turning 21 in October. Depending on what her birth date is, the embassy might be able to get you an early interview, and more importantly, get her an early interview, number one. Number two, Mike touched on this earlier, and we're certainly not going to get into this level of detail on this webinar, but there are certain instances where even if the child's turning 21, the child can actually get a visa, an immigrant visa, even though they're above the age of 21, by using something called the CSPA, the Child Status Protection Act. That's the short version. The long version is where I started. You need to contact the attorney and the recruiter ASAP so that they can strategize exactly what's the drop dead date before your daughter is going to be ineligible to get her visa.
All right. Very good. Thanks, Chris. Tracy.
Yeah, a question about Indian retrogression. Is there any chance for Indian retrogression to end soon or become more current quickly?
Mike.
Yeah, since Chris answered no on the last one, I'll answer no on this one. No. Barring any legislative relief that is significant and huge legislative relief, there is not any good news in sight for Indian retrogression.
Gotcha. All right, next question. I have just started the process for a nurse aid petition, and it's waiting to be filed. Does this mean I'll be waiting for another possible 4 years without being able to travel to the USA?
Perhaps. It might. Nurse aid petitions are also subject to the EB3 date. They're actually subject to something called the EB3 other worker category in most instances. But yeah, I think the reality is right now you're looking at a 4-year retrogression. But tune in October. My guess is that 4-year might be much more favorable.
Right. Yeah, good reminder. Everything becomes more clear in October visa bulletin. Hello, I have a priority date for EB3, which is 23 March of 2023, and a contract. Can I come to America with an H-1B visa during retrogression without canceling my EB3?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're getting a lot more discussion and questions about H-1B, so I think this is a very good question. Mike, Chris, I'll just whoever wants to jump in first on this one.
Sure. There's several factors at play on the H-1B. First of all, the simple part of it is nothing with an H-1B interferes or contradicts your EB3. So there's no inconsistency between having an EB3 I-140 approved and doing an H-1B. Okay. There are certain visas where that would be the case, students and visitors sometimes, but with an H-1B, there's not. However, the key to an H-1B are a couple variables or factors that are relevant. Number one is we have a visa lottery system, H-1B cap lottery, and there's a limited number of H-1s given out. That was done last year in February, March. We filed registrations. We found out in April, and they picked 85,000. They actually picked more than that because of people that drop out. And there was about 400 million submitted. Not really, but it was like almost 900,000. So the odds of being picked in the lottery are not high. Secondly, though, there are certain employers that we refer to as cap exempt employers. And those are employers who are nonprofits affiliated with universities. And the definition is fairly technical, but basically think of those as like university hospitals. It's broader than that, but think of that. Those types of hospitals and facilities are not subject to the H-1B lottery. So they're eligible to file H-1Bs basically year round. Now, the part that's been very difficult for RNs is that traditionally, RNs have very rarely been eligible for H-1Bs because to be eligible for an H-1B, you have to demonstrate that a BSN is the standard. The BSN is the criteria to obtain this job at this facility. And as everyone on this call is probably aware, the U.S. standard for license in every state is simply an associate's degree. So that standard is lower. Now, that doesn't mean you can't qualify for an H-1B, but it has to be very specific type of facility, specific type of position. Both Chris and I have seen an uptick in the filing of H-1Bs for RNs over the last 6 months. And we've seen some good success with those, but not everyone will be eligible. Not every position's eligible. Not every facility is eligible to file. So, Chris, you want to add some stuff to that?
I mean, I think you've hit all the big points, Mike. Yeah, I mean, the H-1Bs they're not common, but they're increasingly better, as Mike was implying. Like he said, the last 6 months or so, we've definitely seen a dramatic uptick. And you probably want to try and get an H-1B cap exempt employer, which would be a university hospital, as Mike said. I'm not saying anything different than Mike. Those, I think, are the two biggest takeaways.
Yeah. When you talk about, not all nursing positions being eligible, only certain types of employers and then certain types of positions. Mike, can you maybe just call out a couple of examples of specific nursing roles that might be considered for the H-1B option?
Sure. I think the key is you have to look at the facility itself and what is the hiring practice in that particular unit for that particular nurse. So you may have nurses in a cardiac care unit that are eligible for hospital A, but nurses that are also CCU nurses in a different facility that are not eligible because the standards of that facility are different. So one of the things we start with the facility is, what are your standards? What are you really hiring to? Do you want a BSN? And there are certain magnet hospitals that have that kind of as their overall standard. But for this unit, we want BSN hired individuals. And then I will tell you what I do with all of my clients is after I've had this meeting where they've all told me, yes, a BSN is mandatory because that's what they want to get an H1, is then I go to their websites and I look at their job postings. And if their job postings for that CCU department under my example is we want a BSN, then great. I've got great proof where I can go to the U.S. government and with my USCIS filing and say, look, the hospital's made this attestation and we've got documented proof that we're hiring a BSN grad. If, however, I go to that website and that job postings and I see it say something like associates required, BSN preferred, well, then all of a sudden I haven't met the standard. So we have to be very careful as to what we can document as the standard is. But I think it's facility by facility, unit by unit. It's not a overall encompassing kind of a CCU gets it, a NICU doesn't. I don't think it works like that.
Yeah. Chris, any thoughts from your perspective on some specific nursing sort of clinical areas that you've seen to be successful in getting H-1Bs?
Yeah. So, when we think about this, first thing I might say is it's a little bit different from the employer and the employee side. So if you're an employer, As you may be able to, you may have a cohort within your hospital system, either a unit, a practice group, a floor, a wing, etc., where with some clever strategizing, clever lawyering, we can create a role within the organization where a bachelor prepared nurse would be essential to the position. We're at our office, we are a little bit pleasantly surprised how, especially with some of the bigger systems, where a lot of these cohorts actually already exist. It's really just a question of putting some formality around what's actually happening within the health system. So I would suggest if you're on this call and you're an employer and you think something like this might apply, or you're even not sure, get in touch with Ron, get in touch with Mike or myself if we're your attorney or whoever your attorney is. And you may have existing practice areas where these arguments actually will work. Like I said, we just have to sort of put four corners around situations that are already happening within your organization. From the employee side, I think as Mike said, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to find a teaching hospital, a university hospital, and then look at their job postings. And if the job posting says bachelor's required, that's one you probably want to get in touch with because they might be H-1B eligible. But if they say associates and maybe bachelor's preferred or something, odds are those are not going to be qualifying for the H-1B visa.
Okay, very good. Tracy, we have time for a couple more questions, so ask away, please.
You got it. A new applicant question. When is a better time to apply, before or after October?
Always before. There's no reason not to apply. This comes under the control which you can control, and what you can control is, have you passed your NCLEX? Have you got your credentialing done, et cetera? Do you think you're qualifying, your qualifications are good for a U.S. employer? If so, I'd apply today. I don't think there's any reason to wait to apply to October. In fact, there's no reason to wait to apply for October. Indeed, if you get a job offer today and you accept that job offer tomorrow, it likely does not mean your I-140 is going to be filed on Friday. It takes a while. There's a legal process here. The recruiter has to do some screening to find a good match for you. The recruiter has to find the right match. They have to get the documentation. They have to interface with the law firm. And then and only then does the case get filed. So this one may be the best question that we've gotten on the call, Ron, because the answer is do not wait. Control what you can control and get your NCLEX passed and apply.
Great. I think that's exactly the advice. And I think just, I would state it, just think of the immigration system operating on a first come, first served basis, right? It's very simplistic, but essentially that's what it is. And an application received today, in theory, is processed ahead of one received tomorrow.
Yeah, it's Mike's processing queue at the grocery store analogy.
Yeah. All right, Tracy.
All right. Are we allowed to travel to the United States while waiting?
Mike.
So that question will depend upon the circumstances, but if you already have a valid visa stamp, like a visitor's visa stamp in your passport and you're waiting for retrogression, then my experience, and you want to come in for a wedding or you want to go to Disney or your nephew's graduating from high school in the fall, my experience has been that you're going to be able to get into the U.S. You're going to explain the purpose of why you're coming to the U.S. I'm here to see my nephew's graduation, baptism, whatever, and I'm only going to be here for 45 days, and then I'm leaving. And I think you're going to have no issues coming in. On the other hand, if you've never had a visa and you're now applying at the consulate, I think you're going to have difficulty, particularly depending on what country you're coming from, in actually getting that visa issued. Now, one point of caution, do not think that coming in as a visitor is going to make and then trying to adjust or change your status once you get here is going to make your case any faster or any easier. It's not going to make it faster. And in fact, it's likely to make it more complicated. Because let's say you traveled in September with the story of you're going to go to your nephew's baptism. And then in October, the bulletin moves forward to the extent that you're now current. And the question we would all get as attorneys is, can I file my adjustment of status because now I'm current? And we're going to go back to, is the USCIS going to believe that you intended in September to only come to the baptism and then go home? Or did you really intend to time it so that you could stay here in the US? And that's going to create some complications and some major risks on your case. So I would not do any traveling without talking to your case manager or your attorney, but there are certainly situations where you can travel to the US even while your case is in process.
Let me just kind of add a follow-up question, because this is one that we see come up very often, and it's around the scenario of, I have a visitor's visa, a B1, B2 visitor's visa. Can I come to the U.S. and can I then adjust my status so I can work? Chris.
Yeah, and I mean, just to extend on what Mike said, I think the general rule of thumb is you should not expect that to be the case. The reality is the U.S. immigration system says if you come in on a visitor's visa, your expectation should be to engage in tourism, go to your nephew's baptism, attend your brother's wedding, visit some family or friends, go to Disneyland, these kinds of things. And so if that is the intention, you're going to be fine. But if in the back of your head you're saying, ooh, and then I might be able to adjust my status and have my visa interview in the United States, that's a no-no. And so from my standpoint, it's pretty simple. You should essentially assume that won't, and you should never try it to happen, because what happens is if you do that and the U.S. immigration official doesn't believe you, even if you're legitimate, but if they don't believe you, you're going to get tagged with immigration fraud, which means not only are you not going to be able to get your green card on this entry while you were at Disneyland, you're not going to get your green card. So your 100% expectation should be come in, attend Disneyland, attend the nephew's baptism, but go back home and do your visa interview in London, Manila, Delhi, wherever you're from around the world. And as long as that's what you expect to do and that's your plan, you're going to be fine. But don't come in on the visitor's visa and think in the back of your head, oh, I'll wait a little bit. I'll be a little clever. I won't tell someone that this is really don't do any of that. That's just poor planning.
Yeah. All right. Tracy, time for one more question.
Okay. Let's go with this one. Regarding the current retrogression, is it possible to process an application to another country?
Mike, you want to jump in?
You think they're meaning, should I go work in another country while I'm processing this? If so, then yes, depending on how long you're going to be gone, how long that contract's going to be. So if you're someone who's living and working in Manila right now and you're just filing now, I think if you talk to your case manager and said, hey, I've got this opportunity to go to Australia, sign a 1-year contract, is that safe? My guess is your case manager is going to say, sure, that's fine.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is oh, go ahead, Mike. Sorry, I thought you were.
Yeah, no, I'm reading some facts into the question that may or may not be accurate, but
right.
That's my guess.
Yeah, no, I'm reading in the same facts you are. The one thing I might suggest to you is you might want to wait till mid-September before making any sort of commitment, because again, come mid-September, we'll get the October visa bulletin. And so with the October visa bulletin, we will be able to give you a much better guess as to when your interview might take place. Because what I would hate to happen is you sign that Australia contract August 1st, and the October visa bulletin is much more optimistic than we're maybe suggesting here. Maybe it's even current. I don't think that's likely, but it's within the realm of possibility. And so I'd hate for you to have been able to get your U.S. visa appointment in October, November, December of this year, but because you're committing to Australia for a year, you can't really have it. And then who knows, maybe it retrogresses again. So the one thing I might suggest is before you're thinking of making any sort of a commitment above, I don't know, 90 days or something, I would probably wait till September. The only other thing that I'm going to read a fact or two into this is the applicant might have been asking, or the question might have been suggesting, hey, I'm in Australia. And so what I would like to do is move my visa appointment from Manila to, let's say, Sydney, because I'm I'm residing in Australia. And my general rule of thumb is I'd like us to do that because legally it's fine. We can do that. We do it all the time. But I do think we want to really be thoughtful about if it makes sense to do that. Now, listen, if you're very early in the process and your priority date is July 20th, 2023, again, I might wait a month and a half to see what the October visa bulletin is. But, if you're going to have a year or something that you're retrogressed, your personal case is retrogressed, then I think it's probably fine to move your appointment from Manila to Sydney. But I've seen too often, and it doesn't happen a lot, but it happens too often, it makes me a little nervous, which is when we get involved to try and move that visa from, say, Manila to Sydney under this example, I'm constantly surprised at how long it takes, how often the U.S. government seems to bumble it and lose it. It always works out in the long run, but it always seems to be a lot more headache, a lot more stress for you and your family, and a lot longer than it takes to do that. So I guess if that's where the question was going, my answer is you can do it, but I think you want to be very thoughtful about if it makes sense in your situation, because in some instances it makes more sense to just leave the appointment in Manila. When the time comes and you're ready for a visa interview, even if you still have a commitment in Australia, you can usually get a week or two off, take that flight back to Manila and do it. But just be thoughtful before you move the location of your visa appointment.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, we're at time. Thank you to everyone who joined us live today for this presentation. Thank you to both Chris and to Mike. Both are great friends and partners of Worldwide HealthStaff and personal friends of mine as well. And so it's been a real a pleasure and privilege to have them joining us today. Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Chris. I know this is a topic where there's more conversation to come. Again, if you're an applicant and want to connect with a HealthStaff recruiter, you can do that on the link. If you are a U.S. healthcare employer and you have questions that relate to anything that was discussed today, feel free just to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to connect you with Chris or Mike or get you the information that you need. We're all working towards the same goal of helping to ensure access to great healthcare services in the U.S. and the work that we're collectively doing and the commitment of our applicants is certainly making a contribution to that. So thank you again for joining us today. Please keep on the lookout for future webinar presentations that we have pretty much on a weekly basis. We'll look forward to sharing a recording of this with everyone tomorrow. In the meantime, I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you again for your interest, and we'll be in touch soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, Ron.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.